It's nice to be back in your pulpit this morning. I had a very nice time on vacation, but there's nothing like quite being back in front of all of you to boost my spirits. This morning's sermon is going to be a bit unusual. It doesn't have a single message or a unifying theme. Instead, it consists of my attempts to respond to questions from the members of the congregation. We had 13 different people submit questions, and in the next 20 to 25 minutes, I'll attempt to respond in some fashion to all of them. I understand that you don't have a tradition of this kind of service here at First Church. Among Unitarian Universalists, though, it's not particularly uncommon. As far as I can tell, question box sermons emerged sometime during the 1950s as part of the broader humanist movement. They were part of our faith's general movement away from being biblically based, a pattern that began all the way back in the mid-19th century with the New England Transcendentalists. Question box sermons were and are an expression of our theology of preaching. Good preaching, you see, is really a dialogue. The preacher listens to the community, observes the wider world, connects with the holy that surrounds us and the infinity of which we are all a part, and then tries to reflect back, lift up, offer up something of it that's of worth to the congregation. If preaching doesn't in some way respond to the concerns of the gathered body, then it will fall flat and risk failing in its task of opening the heart, quickening the mind, moving the hand to action, and expanding our communion with the Most High. With the question box sermon, the act of listening is more explicit. The preacher responds directly to the questions of the congregation. Since ministry is always a shared exercise, I've invited Board President Colin up here to be my questioner. I thought it would be good if we could model in a service the practice of shared leadership between ordained and lay leaders that's essential to the vitality of this congregation. And so with that, I'd like to invite Carolyn to ask our first question.
Okay. If we can't readily be a sanctuary church ourselves, could we support another congregation that does undertake that role?
Should I answer with a simple yes? Northwood's Unitarian Universalist Church in the Woodlands recently decided to become a sanctuary church. We could support their efforts. Alternatively, we could reach out to some of the other congregations in the museum district and see if they'd be interested in collaborating with us to collectively provide sanctuary. So my home congregation, First Parish in Cambridge, did. Together with 3 other Harvard Square churches, they provided sanctuary in concert. Only one of the 4 churches had the physical capacity to be a sanctuary congregation, and so the other congregations joined them by providing them with financial resources, volunteers, and showing up en masse whenever ICE threatened to deport the family that they were hosting. If the broader concern is about the plight of immigrants, there's lots of things we could do. We could organize a regular vigil at an ICE detention facility. We could work to make sure that ICE is unwelcome here in Houston. We could figure out how to support the children whose parents have been deported. They need religious communities like ours to advocate for them and welcome them. We can take a trip to the border and work with migrants there. The congregation has organized to just do that. A group of lay leaders are planning a trip to Laredo next week. They're leaving on August 15th, and if any of you would like to join them, I'm sure that they would be more than happy to have you with them. I'm sure it will be a powerful act of witness and a meaningful expression of solidarity in response to one of the great crises of the hour.
Xenophobia is universal. In the US, it is black-white. In Romania, Hungarian-Romanian. In France, rich, poor, black. Anti-Semitism. Xenophobia has deep human roots.
Now, I have to admit, I'm unsure whether this is a statement or a question. It seems to me like it's an assertion about human nature. It reminds me of the old religious orthodox claim that human beings are innately depraved. While xenophobia can be found in many cultures, I'm personally not willing to believe that it is innately rooted in human nature. Certainly, there's plenty of examples of movements and teachers who sought to transcend it. And we know that sometimes these movements and teachers were successful in moving beyond xenophobia. Jesus preached, "Love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, that you may be children of your Father in heaven. He causes his sun to rise on the evil and the good, and sends rain on the righteous and the unrighteous." Now, we might quibble about the theology, but the message is clear. We are all part of the same human family, and we all share the same fate. We're born, we die, we have some brief time in between. That time is better spent bringing more love into the world than propagating hate. More recently than the first century, Unitarian Universalist theologian Tandeyka has done extensive research on how teaching children racism might be understood as a form of child abuse. She tells us that people who believe they are white are taught about racial supremacy by society, by their families, and unfortunately by their religious communities. And so I think that this is one of the principal purposes of our religious communion today and the other great dissenting traditions. It is to push us to move beyond xenophobia and hatred and towards love and compassion. It is to challenge us to remember the teachings of the great and ordinary people who have allowed love to be the animating principle in their lives. Religious leaders like Jesus or Martin King or Dorothy Day or Rumi or Buddha. Ordinary people like the Gentiles who sheltered Jews during the Holocausts, civil rights workers who bravely committed to nonviolence in the face of the physical, spiritual, and political brutality of white supremacy, the powerful drag queens in New York who 50 years ago inspired pride. The list could go on and on and on. If we were to do any justice to it, we'd really be here all day.
Climate change is worse than we can imagine. I cannot see a practical way forward.
Just this year, the United Nations, drawing upon the overwhelming consensus of scientists, told us that we have 11 years to avert catastrophic climate change. 11 years. General Assembly President Maria Fernanda Espinosa warned, "We are the last generation that can prevent irreparable damage to our planet." The future, though, is unwritten. We might be able to avert this damage and stave off societal collapse and even extinction that comes with it if we act now. Will the human species do so? I don't know. What I do know is this. If we are to confront climate change, we will have to confront the very meaning of the word practical. A few years ago, the Canadian journalist Naomi Klein wrote a book about climate change titled "This Changes Everything." Her basic premise was that the climate crisis was so severe that the only way to move beyond it was to move beyond the fossil fuel-based extractive capitalism that has formed the basis of the global economy for the last 200 years. This will mean challenging and dismantling corporate power, living our lives differently, planning cities like Houston differently, moving forward towards a new kind of society. Can we, as a human species, be impractical and demand the impossible? I don't know. What I do know is that in the 1940s, people in this country and elsewhere were able to radically sacrifice and defeat the existential crisis of Nazism and fascism, and that perhaps we can find a similar moral strength for such a mobilization again.
What led you to the ministry?
Answering this question would take all the time we have remaining and much more. Like many ministers, I have my own story of the call to ministry. Recounting that, however, takes up 10 minutes in and of itself. So the succinct answer, I love Unitarian Universalism and think it has the power to change lives, change communities, and play a role in changing the world. I came a minister because I wanted to live a life of service and help actualize that change. I love people, and I love the privilege of accompanying members of the congregations I have served through the journeys of their lives. There are few other callings that allow someone to be with people in their most intimate moments, celebrating the life of a child, the union of love, or death, and at the same time require reflection, study, and a commitment to social action. So thank you for letting me serve as your minister. It's a great blessing to have such an opportunity.
Is it possible to choose your beliefs? My friends and family feel like I actively abandoned our faith, but I feel like it was something that happened to me. I miss being a part of that community, but I don't think I could ever get myself to literally, earnestly believe in what I used to.
Friends of mine once advised me, Unitarian Universalists do not believe what we want to. We believe what we have to. Honest belief is not chosen. It's something we come to through our experiences. For it is religious experience, the connection to or the absence of the divine, that forms the basis of belief. The experience comes first, our interpretation of it, our beliefs come second. Try as we might, we do not get to choose the experiences we have, and so we do not fully get to choose our beliefs either. To say, I sense a great deal of pain behind this question, and that's understandable. Many of us connect with religious communities through our friends and family, and so leaving a community can feel like leaving them behind. Now, I don't know the fullness of the questioner's story, so let me just say this. We're glad you're here with us, and we want this congregation to be a place of healing and joy for you. In this community, you are loved and you are welcome, and your presence is a blessing beyond belief.
The Unitarian Universalist merger, what was behind it? Got anything interesting or unusual to share? And most of all, what are any theological ramifications? If they are a perfect fit, why didn't they merge sooner?
So I have no juicy pieces of gossip, unfortunately. Probing the theological ramifications would easily require a book. The short story, in 1961, the American Unitarian Association and the Universalist Church of America realized that they shared a great deal more theological ground and that they would be stronger together than they were on their own. A somewhat longer story, there have been people who were both Unitarian and Universalist in their theological orientation in both institutions for more than 150 years. For example, in the middle of the 19th century, the great abolitionist minister Thomas Starr King served both Universalist and Unitarian churches. Going even further back, Unitarianism, which uplifts the humanity of Jesus, and Universalism, which proclaims God's infinite love for all, were two of the theological beliefs deemed most threatening to the Roman Empire. They were explicitly outlawed in the 3rd and 4th centuries when the leadership of the Christian churches became rather cozy with the leadership of the Roman Empire.
Unitarian Universalist churches, are there any deaf members or deaf pastors? How often are hymns updated? And is there a group for single adults, 40s and up?
So 3 questions in one. Yes, there are deaf members in our congregations. My home congregation, Michigan, actually pays a sign language interpreter to be present for all of the services. And yes, I know of at least 2 ministers who are partially deaf and have had successful careers. Said I don't know of any ministers who have devoted themselves entirely to the deaf community in recent years and who preach using sign language. Doesn't mean that such a person does not exist. There are well over 1,000 Unitarian Universalist ministers in the United States alone, and I only know a fraction of them. We introduce new hymns from time to time in our worship services, and if you'd like to suggest one, I'm sure that either Mark or myself would be more than happy to take your suggestion. Personally, I can say I'm always looking for new hymns. Singing the Living Tradition, our gray hymnal, dates from 1994. Singing the Journey, the teal one, dates from 2005. And La Voices del Camino, the Spanish language purple one, dates from 2009. This year we'll be singing at least one hymn a month from it. and I understand that there's a process to compile new hymnals soon. Finally, we don't currently have a singles group for those over the age of 40. If someone is interested in forming one, they should speak with Alma, our membership coordinator, who I'm sure will advise them exactly on what to do to get one underway.
Why are you so political rather than spiritual from the pulpit? Why is your focus on racism and anti-oppression so important to focus on? What gives your life meaning? What are good ways to deal with prejudice in ourselves and others?
So that's 4 very meaty questions. Let me just start with the first. Why am I so political rather than spiritual? We're at a crucial moment in human history. The next decade may well determine whether humanity has a future. Meanwhile, we face the renewed threats of white supremacy, both inside and outside of the government, and an all-out assault on our democracy. Such a time as this requires that I preach from the prophetic tradition. The Hebrew prophets of Isaiah and Jeremiah and Ezekiel and the like went around almost 3,000 years ago in the kingdoms of Judea and Israel, pronouncing doom and offering hope. They proclaimed that if people did not change their ways, the wrath of God would be upon them. And they said that if they changed their ways, God would have mercy for them. And whatever happened, there was always the possibility of repentance and hope. They also said that ultimately justice will prevail upon earth as in heaven. Now, I don't think we need to fear the wrath of God, but it's pretty clear to me that if we don't change our ways, our society and even humanity may well be doomed. Certainly, the government's anti-immigrant policies, the constant threats of mass shootings that we all face, and climate change require us to change our ways. I focus on racism and anti-oppression because I think that the principal change that needs to take place is rooting out racial hatred from our own hearts. I understand it as based in a form of racial capitalism in which the exploitation of black and brown bodies is coupled with the extraction of the resources of the earth to produce wealth for those who believe themselves to be white. We have to overcome that if we are going to have a collective future. What I'm trying and probably failing to communicate is that my decision to be political from the pulpit is not in opposition to spirituality. It's really a specific kind of spirituality, and it's rooted in the things that give my life meaning. And here I'd invoke my parents, Howard and Kathy. During the political rights family values crusades of the 1990s, they told me that they objected to all of those who cast family values as an inherently conservative project, saying, "We have family values. We have liberal family values." And over the years, as far as I can tell, those values boil down to love your family, treasure your friends, bring more beauty into the world, and hate fascism. I have done my best to live by each of those tenets, and doing so has given my life a great sense of meaning. I'm not going to get into the question of how to confront prejudice in ourselves or others in any depth, other than to note that I suggest the hatred is supposed to be of fascism, not fascists. We're called upon to try to love the hell out of the world. We need to love those we struggle against and proceed with the hope, however fragile, that the spark of love that resides in each human breast might somehow flame up and overcome whatever hatred exists in human hearts.
How dogmatic are the 7 principles? What should you do if one of them interferes with justice?
The 7 principles are not a creed. You don't have to believe them to be a Unitarian Universalist. They are a covenant between the Unitarian Universalist congregations. We have freedom of belief, and if you do not believe in one of those principles, you are still welcome and loved in this community. We could have a longer conversation about what beliefs you cannot hold and be a member of a Unitarian Universalist congregation. One could not, for instance, be a neo-Nazi and a Unitarian Universalist. But that is actually a different subject. In order to answer the second question, I would need a case, an example of when one of the principles came into conflict with justice. My short answer is, if there's a conflict between one of the principles and justice, choose justice.
How do you reconcile the Christian sentiment of sin with religion and spirituality? For example, is there sin in Unitarian Universalism, or does it encompass following your own ethical code?
Unitarian Universalists could benefit with a more robust understanding of sin. We rightly reject the idea of original sin, that when we are born there is something inherently wrong with us. We think that each human life begins with an original blessing, a joy, a beauty to be celebrated. It's like our hymn, We Are, written by Yaseh Barnwell. For each child that's born, a morning star rises and sings to the universe who we are. We are our grandmother's prayers. We are our grandfather's dreamings. We are the breaths of our ancestors. We are the Spirit of God. Original sin is not the only kind of sin, though. The theologian Paul Tillich defines sin simply as estrangement or alienation. We sin when we find ourselves estranged from each other and the world that surrounds us. We sin when we give in to white supremacy and proclaim that some people are somehow not part of the whole human family. We sin when we undermine democracy. We sin when we exploit the earth. And yet we can overcome these sins. We can seek reconciliation. We can work for racial justice, build democratic institutions, and seek to live sustainable lives. These are all collective projects, and collective liberation, overcoming our various forms of estrangement, is a great task before us. But sin's also a relevant concept in our personal lives. How many of us are estranged from loved ones? We can work to repair broken relationships. We can call the child or the parent with whom we have become estranged. We can reach out to the friend we have hurt or with whom we have grown apart. We can do something about estrangement, and we can do something about sin.
What is the purpose of Unitarian Universalism in today's world? What aspects of Universalism are important for us now?
When I was at my final year at Harvard, the philosopher and theologian Cornel West and I were in conversation, and he told me, Unitarian Universalism is one of the last best hopes for institutional religion. Unitarian Universalism's purpose today is to demonstrate that religion can be and is relevant for the world we live in. That means both nurturing loving and joyous communities that tend to the human spirit and provide places for free inquiry and organizing ourselves to confront the great crises of the hour. Future generations will ask of us, history knocked on your door. Did you answer? The purpose of Unitarian Universalism today is really to inspire each of us to answer that question with a beautiful, joyous yes. As for Universalism, the most important aspect of Universalism today is proclaiming the belief that love is the most powerful force in the universe. Love is not easy, it's difficult, challenging, transformative. And here I would invoke the great Russian author Fyodor Dostoevsky. Active love is a harsh and fearful thing compared with love and dreams. Love and dreams thirst for immediate action, quickly performed with everyone watching. Whereas active love is labor and persistence, and for some people, perhaps a whole science.
How can we effectively promote social justice?
Social justice, or social change, happens through the creation of new ways of being in the world and the creation of new institutions. Unitarian Universalist congregations can both be sites for pursuing those new ways of being and nurture new forms of institutional life. Our understanding that salvation is primarily a social, collective enterprise rather than an individual one makes us well equipped for such work. And it's no accident that the ACLU and the NAACP both have roots in Unitarian Universalist congregations, or that Roe versus Wade was partially organized out of one. When we gather, we are free to imagine a different world, a better world, and we are free to experiment amongst ourselves in bringing that world to fruition. We can be a space that welcomes and loves all in a world full of hate. We can seek to live lives of sustainability. We can practice democracy. And in doing so, we can demonstrate that living in such a way is a possibility, desirable, enjoyable, and worthwhile. we can save ourselves.
In the face of the drift toward well, let me try that again. I'm just going to be loud over here. In the face of the drift toward totalitarianism, how do Unitarian Universalists stand to protect democratic values?
I suspect that the person who asked this question heard my men's lectures on the same subject. And since those lectures run some 26,000 words and are currently in the process of being translated into a book, I will spare you the meat of them. Instead of answering the question, I'll just say this. I think that much of our work together in the coming year needs to focus on how to collectively move forward as a religious community to develop the spiritual resources to confront the intertwined crises of the hour. All of these crises are rooted in the same form of sin, in estrangement from each other and from our beloved blue-green ball of a planet. They are at their core religious and spiritual crises, and it is the task of Unitarian Universalists and all of the good-hearted people of the world to confront these crises and, in the spirit of Martin King, undergo a great moral revolution where we'll move from a thing-oriented society to a person and planet-oriented society. Those being all of our questions, I invite the congregation to close with a prayer. O Spirit of love and justice, known by many names, God, Goddess, the human spark that leaps from each to each, let us nurture in each other a spirit of inquiry, a desire to seek the truth, knowing that whatever answers we find will always be partial, and that human knowledge will always be imperfect. Remind us, too, that the future is unwritten, and that our human hearts and our human hands have been blessed with the ability to play a role, however small and humble, in the shaping of the chapter to come. Be with us, be with this community, so that we will have the strength to answer the question, history knocked on your door, did you answer? With an enthusiastic yes. That it may be so, I invite the congregation to say, Amen.